Title: The Brother's Keeper. Chapter 1. The Return. Ben had always felt there was something different about Jeff, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. They were brothers after all, brothers who grew up together, sharing everything from childhood memories to their deepest secrets. But that bond was breaking, like a thread snapped by some invisible force, and Ben could feel it in the air. Something was changing in Jeff, something that went beyond mere adolescence. It was as if his brother was slipping away from him, but in a way that made Ben's skin crawl. The house was quiet, quieter than it had ever been. The lights were dim, the halls silent, and the air in the house was thick with an unsettling stillness that Ben couldn't shake. It wasn't the usual sort of quiet that came with the late hours of the night. No, this was different. This was a silence that felt like it was waiting for something to happen. Something terrible. The walls seemed to press in on him, the floors creaking under the weight of some unseen presence. Ben sat in his room staring at the ceiling, his mind racing. His thoughts were tangled, thoughts that he couldn't quite unravel. He tried to focus on the simple things, his homework, his music, the soft glow of the moonlight through the window. But it was no use. His thoughts always returned to Jeff. The last few weeks had been strange, more strange than usual. Jeff had become distant, almost vacant. He rarely spoke, and when he did, it was in a tone Ben had never heard before, cold, almost robotic. His once sharp, mischievous eyes now seemed vacant, like he was staring through everything and everyone around him, as though he didn't really see them. His once jovial demeanor was replaced by an unsettling quietness that gnawed at Ben's nerves. And then there were the strange incidents, things that had started happening late at night, things Ben couldn't explain. At first, it was little things. A light flickering in Jeff's room when the rest of the house was dark. The sound of footsteps in the hallway when no one was there. But then it escalated. Ben had heard what sounded like whispers, soft, almost imperceptible voices coming from Jeff's room. Voices that didn't belong to anyone Ben knew. The first time it happened, Ben had chalked it up to his imagination. After all, he was just a teenager, and teenagers often let their minds wander, especially in the dead of night. But the whispers grew more persistent. They grew louder, and it wasn't just a voice anymore, it was a presence. He could feel it when he was near Jeff's door, that heavy weight in the air, like something was watching him, waiting for him to cross that threshold. He told himself it was nothing. Jeff was just going through some phase, some strange, rebellious period, like every teenager did. But deep down, Ben knew that wasn't the case. This was different. This was something darker, something far more sinister. On the night everything changed, Ben had just finished dinner and was retreating to his room when he heard it. It was a soft sound at first, barely noticeable above the hum of the house. But as he listened more intently, it grew louder, a slow, rhythmic tapping coming from somewhere down the hall. At first, Ben thought it was just the wind, or the house settling, but then it became too consistent, too deliberate. It was a knock. Someone was knocking. With a sense of dread crawling up his spine, Ben crept from his room and out into the hallway. He stood still for a moment, straining his ears, trying to pinpoint the source of the noise. It was coming from Jeff's room. His heart pounded. Ben wasn't sure why he felt so afraid. It wasn't just the noise, it was the silence that followed. The house seemed to hold its breath, waiting. Ben glanced around, half expecting to see someone standing in the hallway, but the darkness pressed in on him, filling the space with an eerie emptiness. He reached Jeff's door and hesitated for a moment. It was almost as if some invisible force was holding him back. The air around the door felt heavier, suffocating, and the hair on the back of his neck stood on end. He knocked once, tentatively. Nothing. He knocked again, harder this time. "Jeff?" Ben called out, his voice wavering with uncertainty. "Hey, you all right in there?" Still nothing. Ben reached for the doorknob, his fingers trembling as he turned it. The door creaked open slowly, the sound of the hinges echoing in the stillness of the house. He stepped inside. Jeff's room was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of a lamp on the desk. The room was eerily neat, as if Jeff hadn't touched anything in weeks. No dirty clothes on the floor, no discarded papers or books, nothing out of place. The silence was deafening. "Jeff?" Ben's voice was a whisper now, almost afraid to disturb the unnatural stillness that hung in the room. There was no answer. Ben's gaze moved across the room, stopping on the corner where Jeff's figure sat. He was sitting on the edge of the bed, his back facing Ben. His head was lowered, his dark hair hanging in front of his face like a curtain. His body was unnaturally still, as if he was frozen in place. "Jeff?" Ben tried again, stepping closer, his heart pounding in his chest. He wasn't sure why, but he was afraid to approach his brother. The atmosphere in the room felt wrong. It was as if the very air had turned thick and suffocating, like something was watching him, something he couldn't see but could feel, something that didn't belong. There was a moment of complete silence. Then, Jeff slowly raised his head. Ben's blood ran cold. Jeff's eyes were wide open, but they weren't right. They were hollow. The pupils were dilated, nearly black, and his gaze was vacant, as if there was no one home. The skin around his eyes was stretched too tight, his face gaunt and pale, his lips twisted into a strange, unsettling grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Ben!" Jeff's voice was barely a whisper, but it sounded wrong. It was hollow, as if it were being spoken through a voice that wasn't his own. "You should have stayed away." Ben's mouth went dry. A chill ran down his spine, and he took a step back, his heart racing in his chest. "Jeff, what's happening to you?" His voice cracked. "This isn't you. Please, tell me you're okay." Jeff didn't respond. He just continued to stare at Ben with those cold, lifeless eyes, the grin never fading from his face. "I'm fine," Jeff said, his voice soft and distorted. "I'm just getting ready." "Ready for what?" Ben asked, his voice barely above a whisper. For a moment, Jeff didn't answer. He just stared at Ben, his eyes unblinking. The room seemed to grow colder, the shadows deepening in the corners, as though something was moving in the dark. Something that wasn't visible but could still be felt, pressing in on him from all sides. "Ready for the end?" Jeff whispered finally, his grin widening into something monstrous. Ben's breath caught in his throat. The end. It was then that Ben noticed something that made his blood run cold. The reflection in Jeff's bedroom mirror. In the glass, the room appeared differently. The shadows were longer, darker, as if they had weight to them. And in the reflection, something else was standing behind Jeff, something tall, black, and formless, its shape barely visible but undeniably there. Ben felt his knees buckle as he stepped back, his mind screaming. He didn't understand what he was seeing, but his body knew. He had to get out. "Jeff, please, what is this?" Ben asked, his voice frantic. He turned, his legs already moving toward the door, but Jeff's voice stopped him cold. "Don't go," Jeff said, his voice an eerie echo. "It's too late for that." Ben spun around, but Jeff wasn't there anymore. The room was empty. The mirror was empty. Everything was still. The shadows were the only thing moving now, creeping closer, swirling together like dark tendrils that reached out for him. And then he heard it, a whisper. "You should have stayed away, Ben." Chapter 2. The Stranger in the Mirror. Ben hadn't meant to spy on his brother. He wasn't the type to creep around behind Jeff's back, especially not after everything that had happened in the past few months. But something in the air had changed. A silence had descended on their home that hadn't been there before. The walls seemed to breathe. The house felt too still, too empty, even with their parents downstairs. The air felt thick with something intangible, something Ben couldn't shake. It all started when he noticed the shadows. At first, it was nothing more than a flicker out of the corner of his eye. Just a brief movement that left him doubting his own perception. But then it grew stronger. At night, after the rest of the family had gone to bed, Ben would hear things, soft rustling, a door creaking open, a muffled whisper carried through the vents. He'd rush to Jeff's room, hoping to catch him before he did something. Strange again. But each time Jeff was always silent, sitting motionless in the dark. He was becoming more and more elusive, more unpredictable. And worse still, Jeff seemed to have no sense of time. Hours would pass, and Ben would find him in the same position, staring at nothing. This particular night, however, Something felt different. The air in the hallway was unnaturally cold. Ben had tried to ignore it, but it was like a weight on his chest, pushing down on him. As he crept closer to Jeff's door, he saw that the light under the crack of the door was still on. Unusual, given Jeff's typical habits of retreating into darkness. The flickering light seemed to pulse with a strange rhythm, a heartbeat of its own. He couldn't resist. Ben pressed his ear to the door. "Ben!" The whisper was faint, almost drowned out by the humming in the walls. His heart clenched. That wasn't Jeff's voice. It was different, deeper, more ancient. Ben's breath caught in his throat. The urge to leave was overwhelming, but he couldn't bring himself to walk away. Something was pulling him in. Something sinister. Something that wasn't right. He pushed the door open, just a crack. The room was bathed in a dim, flickering light from the desk lamp on Jeff's desk. But Jeff wasn't at the desk, wasn't lying on the bed as Ben had expected. No, he was standing before the mirror. Ben's stomach lurched. Jeff was staring at his reflection, his face pale. Too pale. His eyes were hollow, deep pits of darkness, as if all the light had drained from them. His expression was frozen in a twisted grin, stretched unnaturally wide, so wide that it seemed like his skin was about to tear. His lips were cracked, and his teeth, sharp, yellowed, glinted in the dim light. But it wasn't just Jeff Ben was seeing. There was something else behind him, in the mirror, a figure standing just out of focus. Its outline was blurred, like the reflection of a shadow, but there was something more, something Ben couldn't describe. It was as though the figure was bleeding into the glass, folding into it, as if it were a part of the mirror itself. Jeff's eyes never moved. His gaze stayed fixed on the mirror, as if trapped in it. Ben's breath came shallow, but he couldn't tear himself away. "Go to sleep, Ben." The voice, familiar, yet not, whispered from the darkness within the reflection. Ben recoiled as if struck. His knees buckled and he fell back, the door creaking loudly. His heart pounded in his ears. He hadn't meant to make a sound. He hadn't meant to be seen. But Jeff, that thing, in the mirror heard him. Slowly, Jeff turned, his head jerking at an unnatural angle. His smile was now gone, replaced with an empty stare. No, not empty. His eyes were voids. And in those dark pits, Ben saw something. Something terrible. A slow, insidious crawl of madness. "You shouldn't have looked, Ben." Jeff's voice was colder than ice, his lips curling into something that barely resembled a human smile. Ben stumbled back, knocking into the doorframe as he tried to retreat, but his legs were frozen. "Jeff, please," he whispered, his voice a tremble. But it wasn't Jeff anymore, was it? The thing, Jeff, took a step forward, the sound of his feet dragging across the floor louder than it should have been. The closer it came, the more Ben felt his sanity slip away. It wasn't just Jeff standing there. It was something else, something more sinister, something that wasn't bound by the rules of reality. "I see you now." Jeff, the thing, whispered, its head tilting as if inspecting Ben like a specimen. The voice that followed was like a distant echo, as if another presence was speaking through him. "You should have stayed away," Ben's mind screamed. This was wrong. This wasn't his brother. Whatever had taken Jeff was not him anymore. "Who?" Ben choked, unable to finish his sentence. "Who am I?" Jeff repeated, his smile returning. "I'm everything you've never wanted to face. I'm the thing you saw lurking in the corners of your room when you were a child. I'm the darkness you cannot escape." Ben stumbled backward, his hands grasping at the walls for support. His pulse raced. The air was thick with something unnatural, suffocating. He could feel his heart beating in his throat, his breath shallow. The shadows in the room began to stretch, curling around him like tendrils of smoke, pulling at him, whispering his name in 1,000 voices. The figure in the mirror, it wasn't just an image anymore. It was real. The man, the creature, whatever it was now standing in the corner of the room, its presence overwhelming, suffocating the space. "Jeff," Ben whispered, his voice barely audible. He was crying now. The tears streamed down his face, but it didn't matter. Nothing mattered anymore. "Please, you have to fight it. This isn't you. This isn't you." Jeff didn't answer. The figure just stared. And then, with a slow, deliberate motion, it spoke again. "Sleep, Ben, sleep. It will be easier if you do." Ben felt his vision blur, the edges of reality beginning to crumble. It wasn't just the entity that had taken Jeff. Something else was pulling at him, drawing him into that black abyss of shadows. His body trembled. His mind began to slip. And for the first time in his life, he felt utterly powerless. As he tried to scream, the last thing he saw before everything went black was Jeff. His eyes locked onto him, hollow and devoid of anything human, his lips whispering, one final time, "Go to sleep." This chapter escalates the supernatural tension surrounding Jeff's transformation and sets the stage for Ben's mental unraveling. It blends psychological horror with eerie, almost haunting imagery, drawing the reader deeper into the story's mystery. Chapter 3. The Transformation. The days blurred together, each one a haunting echo of the last. Ben could no longer trust his own perception of time, and the house, once familiar, once comforting, had become something alien. Each creaking floorboard, every whisper of the wind outside, seemed to have grown louder, as if the world itself was conspiring to close in on him. He had tried to convince himself it was just his imagination running wild, but deep down, he knew it was something far more sinister. Something was happening to Jeff, and no matter how hard Ben tried to deny it, something was happening to him as well. It was the look in Jeff's eyes that unsettled him most. Those eyes, once vibrant, filled with mischief and life, had become vacant, glassy, as if they were no longer his brother's eyes at all. Ben could feel that hollow stare on him, even when they weren't in the same room, as though Jeff's presence had grown larger, all-encompassing. It was like being watched by something other. The tension between them grew with every passing day. Ben would go to school, and when he came home, he found the house darker, quieter, more suffocating. The strange occurrences had become frequent now, objects shifting on their own, the strange tapping sounds coming from Jeff's room late at night, the flickering of the lights as though the electricity itself was trying to escape from the house. Every night, Ben lay in his bed, staring up at the ceiling, wondering if the shadows creeping in through his window were the natural darkness of the night or something far more dangerous, something that watched and waited. Tonight, the air felt heavier than usual. It was thick with an unsettling energy, and Ben could feel it pressing against his chest, making it harder to breathe. He lay in his bed, the sheets tangled around his legs, the glow from his alarm clock the only light in the room. He tried to ignore the familiar thrum of fear in his veins, tried to push it to the back of his mind. But tonight, it was different. Tonight, the fear had teeth. He glanced at the clock, 2:47 a.m. Ben had spent hours tossing and turning, unable to escape the feeling that someone, was in the house with him. He told himself it was nothing, that his mind was simply playing tricks on him. But when he heard it, the low, guttural growl coming from down the hall, his breath caught in his throat. It wasn't the first time he'd heard it. In the dead of night, when everything else was still, he had started hearing sounds. Muffled footsteps, breathing that wasn't his own, whispers that didn't make sense. But tonight, it was different. The growl wasn't soft, like it had been before. No, this time, it was a low, throaty sound, a rumble that seemed to shake the very walls of the house. Ben froze. He wasn't sure if he should go check on Jeff, if he should run, but he couldn't stay in his room any longer, not with that sound rattling his bones. He pulled himself from the bed, his feet meeting the cold floor with a soft thud. He crept to the door, his heart thudding in his chest. The house was still, eerily so. But that growl, it lingered in the air, hanging over him like a dark omen. He moved through the hall, his footsteps muffled on the carpet. The hallway was dim, lit only by the faint glow of moonlight that filtered through the window at the far end. Everything was silent except for that noise, that growl, still echoing in the walls. It was deeper now, almost otherworldly. Ben could feel his pulse quicken as he approached Jeff's room. The door was slightly ajar, the faint light from within spilling into the hallway. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the doorknob. His breath came in shallow gasps as he tried to calm himself, but the fear inside him was like a living thing, clawing at his insides. He pushed the door open just a crack. Inside, Jeff was sitting on the edge of his bed, his back turned to Ben. His posture was unnaturally stiff, as though he was made of stone rather than flesh. His hands were folded tightly in his lap, his fingers twitching slightly, as if they had a mind of their own. The faint moonlight that slanted through the window illuminated his face, but it did nothing to soothe the cold knot in Ben's stomach. "Jeff," Ben whispered, his voice barely audible. He didn't know what he was expecting. Perhaps a response, perhaps the usual sarcastic remark, but Jeff didn't answer. There was no sound, no movement. It was as though Jeff had turned into a statue. Ben stepped forward, slowly, cautiously. He could feel the tension growing, thickening the air around him. His footfalls were silent on the carpet. But the closer he got to Jeff, the more oppressive the silence became. It felt as though the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. "Jeff, what's going on?" Ben asked again, his voice trembling. But Jeff didn't answer. Then, with a suddenness that startled Ben, Jeff turned his head. His eyes, those empty, hollow eyes, locked onto Ben, and for a moment, Ben couldn't breathe. The expression on Jeff's face was not anger, not sadness, but something far worse. It was blank, empty, as if the soul that had once inhabited that body was no longer there. Something else was in its place, something alien, something dark. "Ben." Jeff's voice was low, distorted, as if it was being spoken from a great distance. "I've been waiting for you." Ben took a step back, his heart hammering in his chest. His eyes darted around the room, searching for anything that might explain what was happening. The shadows in the corners seemed to shift, twisting and writhing, as though they had a life of their own. "Waiting for me," Ben whispered, his voice barely a sound. Jeff's lips curled into a twisted smile, but it was a smile without joy, without warmth. It was a smile that seemed to mock him, to twist the very air around them into something suffocating. "I've been waiting for this moment. You've always been here, Ben. You just never saw it." Ben's breath caught in his throat. He didn't understand. What was Jeff talking about? What was happening to him? "Jeff, what's going on?" Ben asked again, his voice shaking with fear. "Tell me what's happening to you." Jeff's eyes didn't leave him. They were so empty, so hollow, that it felt like they were sucking him in, drawing him closer to something he couldn't even comprehend. "It's too late, Ben," he said softly. "It's already begun." Suddenly there was a loud crash from behind him, and Ben spun around, his heart racing. The room felt colder now, colder than it had ever been before. The shadows were deeper, darker. The growl, a deep animalistic growl, was back, louder than ever, reverberating through the walls. Something was in the house with them. Ben turned back to Jeff, but his brother was no longer sitting on the bed. Instead, he was standing, his form towering over Ben with an unnatural, fluid movement. He was moving too fast, too smoothly, like a predator stalking its prey. His eyes were no longer hollow. They were black, as if they had swallowed the light, as if they were black holes, pulling everything into them. "Jeff," Ben breathed, taking a step back, his voice barely a whisper. But Jeff, if that was still Jeff, didn't speak. Instead, he lunged forward, his hand outstretched, fingers clawed, his face twisted in a grotesque, inhuman expression, his smile widening far beyond what was possible. Ben didn't have time to react. The shadows surged around him, engulfing him in darkness, and everything went black. Chapter 4. The Descent. The darkness clung to Ben like a second skin, wrapping around him and suffocating his every thought. His mind was a haze, his body paralyzed by the overwhelming sensation of being trapped in a nightmare that had no end. The shadows, thick and consuming, surrounded him. He could hear nothing but his own breath, ragged, panicked. Yet somehow, everything around him felt too quiet, too still. Where was he? His hand moved to his face, but instead of touching his skin, it met the cool, damp surface of the floor. Panic flared up inside him. He was on the ground. The hard, cold floor felt like stone, its surface rough against his fingertips. He tried to push himself up, but his limbs felt sluggish, as though they were encased in concrete, heavy and unresponsive. The sensation was wrong. Every movement felt alien, every breath deeper than the last, as if the world around him was pulling him into its suffocating grip. The growling, that sound. It rumbled through the darkness again, louder this time, filling the air with a guttural, almost primal force. His blood ran cold as he tried to focus on the sound, trying to place it, trying to reason with himself. What was that? He blinked rapidly, attempting to clear his head, but the shadows remained, creeping at the edge of his vision. The air itself seemed to warp, thick and oppressive. Was this real? His thoughts felt hazy, disconnected, as if they weren't entirely his own. He tried to breathe deeper, to steady himself, but the air seemed to turn to ash in his lungs. The taste of metal lingered on his tongue. "Ben!" The voice was a whisper, so faint at first that he thought it was a figment of his imagination. But then, again, his name, this time clear, but twisted. "Ben!" Ben's heart skipped a beat. It was Jeff, or at least it sounded like Jeff, but it wasn't the voice he remembered. It wasn't the voice of the brother he had grown up with. This voice was cold, distorted, hollow, as though it had been scraped from the depths of something unnatural. Ben tried to push himself up again, but the shadows swirled around him, pulling him back down. "Ben, come closer." The whisper came again, this time more insistent. The air grew colder still, and Ben shivered, his breath coming out in short, ragged gasps. His hands trembled as they scraped against the floor, pushing him forward, inch by agonizing inch. With every move he made, the darkness seemed to close in tighter. His mind screamed at him to run, to escape, but his body refused to cooperate. The shadows grew darker, thicker, until he could no longer make out anything around him. The growl reverberated again, louder, more deafening. It was coming from everywhere, from all directions, as though the house itself had become a living thing, breathing and pulsing with malevolent intent. Ben's chest tightened, and he could feel his breath quicken. Panic clawed at him, and his eyes darted wildly, seeking an escape that wasn't there. The whisper came again, louder, clearer this time. "Come closer!" He stumbled forward, his body betraying him. Every step was a struggle, the ground beneath him uneven, slick with something that felt wet. No, it wasn't just wet, it was sticky, as though the floor was alive, crawling beneath him. "Jeff?" Ben's voice was hoarse, barely a whisper. "Is that you?" The reply was a low chuckle, one that sent a chill straight to his bones. It wasn't Jeff's laugh. It was too hollow, too empty. "Who are you?" Ben whispered, terror seeping into his words. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then the voice came again, cold and full of venom. "I am what he has become." Ben's heart slammed against his chest. His thoughts spun wildly, trying to make sense of the words, but his mind refused to cooperate. Was Jeff speaking to him? Was Jeff still alive in there, somewhere? Or had he already been replaced, consumed by whatever darkness had taken hold of him? The shadows seemed to pulse in rhythm with his heartbeat, beating faster, louder, until Ben felt as though his very soul was being dragged into them. And then, through the inky blackness, he saw it, a faint outline, a shape, a figure moving toward him. "Jeff!" Ben's voice cracked. He wasn't sure if he wanted to see his brother, or if he feared what had become of him. But the figure wasn't Jeff, not anymore. Not in any sense Ben could recognize. It was a thing, shifting and twisting in the shadows, its form an unsettling amalgamation of what could only be described as pure wrongness. Its limbs were elongated, its skin ashen and sickly, slick with some unnatural substance that glistened in the faintest sliver of light. Its face, Jeff's face, was stretched, pulled into a grotesque grin that twisted its features into a mask of malevolent joy. The eyes. Those eyes were the worst part. They were no longer human, no longer filled with the glint of mischief and emotion. They were black, hollow, abyssal. They were empty. The thing that had once been Jeff tilted its head, its eyes locking onto Ben, and Ben could feel the weight of its gaze press down on him, suffocating him with its unnatural presence. It stepped closer, its movements jerky, disjointed, as though it wasn't fully tethered to the world it inhabited. Ben recoiled, fear flooding through him, but his body was frozen in place. The air around him thickened, closing in on him, and he could hear the whispers, soft and insidious, from all around him. The shadows had become voices. They were everywhere. The thing moved closer, its lips parting in a mocking, cruel smile. "You should have left when you had the chance, Ben," it crooned, its voice low and guttural, like nails on a chalkboard. "Now, you will never escape." Ben's heart pounded in his chest, his breath coming in shallow, panicked gasps. "No! No, please!" His words were barely audible, swallowed by the overwhelming presence of the thing before him. It was so close now. So close he could almost feel its cold breath on his skin. "Don't worry, Ben," the thing said, its voice a twisted mockery of the one he had known. "You're not alone. You never were." With a final sickening laugh, the thing lunged forward, its hands stretching toward him with unnatural speed. Ben screamed, but the sound was lost in the overwhelming chaos of the shadows. Everything was swallowed by darkness. The growl grew louder, drowning out all other sound. And then there was nothing. Chapter 5. The Veil of Reality. Extended. Ben's mind had begun to unravel, thread by thread. The room, once familiar in its emptiness, had transformed into a labyrinth of distortion, its walls pulsating with an almost sentient malice. His feet shuffled across the floor, each step feeling like it was no longer his own, but a reluctant movement directed by something far more sinister. The air was heavy with moisture, thick with an unnatural chill that sunk deep into his bones. It wasn't the cold of winter, nor the dampness of decay. It was something worse, something that felt as though it were bleeding from the very walls of the space around him. He tried to speak, but his voice was strangled in his throat. His words caught somewhere between a whisper and a scream. The faintest tremor escaped his lips. What was happening? The shadows, which had once been mere silhouettes, were now tangible, crawling and writhing like living things, their forms shifting and morphing as they grew in size and presence. They crept across the floor, pooling in corners, gathering behind him. The very air was saturated with a suffocating pressure, as if the world itself were closing in on him. The silence so thick it felt like a scream was about to break through at any moment. And then it happened. A voice, a low, guttural sound, like a voice emerging from the depths of a forgotten grave, spoke. Ben. His name was drawn out, elongated, each syllable dragging itself through the air like something ancient, something wrong. It echoed from all directions, reverberating against the walls, the floor, the very fibers of his being. He froze. His heart, which had been hammering in his chest, suddenly stopped, its beat stuttering in his ribcage. The air grew colder, the shadows grew darker. Ben blinked, and in that instant, the room shifted again. No longer was it a simple space, a corner in an abandoned house. Now it seemed vast, infinite, like a cavernous hole swallowing him whole. His breath grew shallow, visible in front of his face in small, trembling clouds. He could feel it, the change, the weight of something watching him, something that had always been there but had remained just beyond his perception. But now it was closer, much closer. Ben, come closer. The voice rasped again, closer now, so close that it no longer felt like it was being spoken to him, but whispered directly into his ear. He turned, despite himself, and there, emerging from the darkness, was the figure, the form of his brother, Jeff, or at least what used to be Jeff. It was distorted, twisted beyond recognition, but there was no denying the familiarity in the shape, the face. That face, those eyes, Jeff's eyes, wide and unblinking, hollowed out and empty, voids of darkness where once there had been a spark of life. His lips stretched unnaturally into a grotesque frozen grin, a smile that felt like a curse itself. Ben's chest tightened, a choked gasp escaping him as he stumbled backward. His mind reeled, fighting against the growing terror. This wasn't Jeff, not anymore. This thing was something else. It was an imitation, a grotesque parody of the brother he had once known. The figure took a step forward, the sound of its footfalls like the scraping of bone on stone. Ben's eyes widened in fear as it drew closer, its form warping, flickering like a faulty film reel. For a moment, it seemed to lose shape altogether, becoming nothing but a mass of writhing shadows. And then, with a sickening clarity, the figure coalesced again, closer, standing right in front of him. Right in front. Its presence was overwhelming. Impossible to ignore, impossible to escape. "You can't hide from me," Jeff's voice crooned. But it was wrong. It was hollow, like an echo of something lost. It had no warmth, no compassion. It was a void, a chasm of emptiness. Ben's hand shot out, pressing against the wall to steady himself, his breathing coming in shallow gasps. "No, no, please, Jeff." His voice faltered, but the words were meaningless, lost in the oppressive weight of the creature in front of him. The thing that had once been his brother tilted its head, its eyes growing darker, deeper, until they swallowed all light. "You should never have followed me, Ben. You should have let me go. But now you're mine too." The words hit Ben like a physical blow, knocking the wind from his lungs. The room seemed to shrink, the walls pressing in on him as the thing that had been Jeff moved closer, its hand reaching out, fingers elongated and twitching, as if they weren't entirely in sync with the body they were attached to. Ben recoiled, but his legs were weak, unresponsive, like the world around him had become a thick tar, each movement sluggish, impossible. His vision blurred, and for a moment he was consumed by darkness, an all-encompassing blackness that felt like drowning in a sea of nothingness. The shadows swirled around him, the dark mass growing, feeding on his fear, creeping into his mind, wrapping around his heart with icy fingers. "You can't escape me," Jeff's voice murmured, no longer a voice at all, but a whisper inside his head, slithering into his thoughts. Ben gasped, trying to scream, to fight back, but no sound came. His mouth moved, but the words were swallowed by the suffocating silence that filled the room. He was trapped, locked in a cage of darkness and despair, with no hope of escape. The figure of Jeff leaned in closer, its face mere inches from Ben's. The grin twisted wider, impossibly wide, as if it wanted to devour him whole. "You've always been mine, Ben. I just needed you to see it, to understand." And then the darkness swallowed him. Ben's body went rigid, his heart stopping. The coldness filled him, rushing in with the force of an avalanche. An overwhelming, suffocating cold that drained the last traces of warmth from his veins. The darkness consumed him entirely, until there was no Ben left. No memories, no thoughts, just the void. And then there was nothing. Chapter 6. The Shadow's Grip. Ben couldn't escape the feeling that the house itself was alive. It wasn't just the silence that pressed in on him, suffocating his every breath. It wasn't just the way the air had grown unnaturally still, as if it was holding its breath, waiting for something, waiting for him. No, it was something far more insidious. The walls, the floors, even the windows seemed to be watching him, shifting, twisting under his gaze. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the curtains sent a jolt through him, and with each passing moment he felt as if the house were slowly closing in. The shadows had deepened, curling like tendrils, reaching into the corners of his vision. They followed him, no matter where he turned. He was being watched, not just by the house, but by something else, something that had been waiting, patient and hungry, for him to wander too far into the darkness. Ben glanced over his shoulder again, his heart hammering in his chest. There was nothing there. Just the empty hallway behind him, bathed in the dim, flickering light of a single bulb. But he could feel it. The oppressive weight of something in the air, something thick and suffocating, as if the atmosphere itself had changed. He had to get out. He needed to escape. The sensation of being trapped was driving him to the edge of madness. But the door, the front door, was just ahead. Only a few more steps, and he'd be free. Yet with every step he took, it seemed further away, the distance stretching endlessly, as if the house itself was pushing him back. The hallway seemed to elongate, twisting unnaturally as though the space itself had grown deeper. He stumbled, his vision wavering, and for a moment he thought he saw something, or someone, moving just at the edge of his sight. But when he blinked, it was gone. The silence was unbearable. Then he heard it. A faint sound, distant at first, like a whisper, or perhaps a footstep. But as it grew louder, Ben could no longer ignore it. His breath caught in his throat as he turned to face the source. The sound was coming from upstairs. For a split second, he considered fleeing. Running out of the house, into the night, away from whatever nightmare had set its sights on him. But someone, was up there. He had to know. He had to. Ben's feet moved against his will, each step slower than the last as he ascended the stairs. The staircase creaked beneath his weight, groaning like a living creature, protesting his intrusion. The hallway at the top of the stairs stretched out before him like a blackened void. The walls here were covered in peeling wallpaper, the faded patterns almost unrecognizable, as if the house itself had been rotting for years, its secrets locked away in the dark. The whispering grew louder. It wasn't just a whisper anymore. It was a voice that was simultaneously soothing and terrifying. A voice that beckoned to him. Ben's blood ran cold as he recognized it. It was his mother's voice. Ben. Her voice was soft, almost tender, as if she were calling him in from the cold, asking him to come back. But there was something in the tone, a subtle distortion, an undercurrent of malice. Ben, come closer. You're not alone. I'm here. His heart leapt into his throat. His mother. No. He hadn't seen her in years, not since that night, that horrible night. How could she be here? And why was she calling him? Her voice so wrong, so twisted. The voice came again, more insistent now. Ben, come closer. Ben's chest tightened, his instincts screaming at him to run, to flee, to not go toward the sound. But he felt himself moving, his legs moving on their own accord, his feet carrying him forward despite every warning flashing in his mind. The shadows thickened around him, stretching longer, reaching out, pulling him toward the darkness at the end of the hallway. He wanted to scream, to break free, but his mouth was dry, his voice lost. His mind was a blur, everything drowning in the maddening echo of his mother's voice. He reached the door at the end of the hallway. The whispering had become a chant now, words he couldn't understand, twisted syllables that wound through the air like barbed wire. He hesitated, his hand hovering just inches from the doorknob. There was a feeling here, a presence, that told him that whatever was beyond this door wasn't his mother. It couldn't be. But the door creaked open anyway. Inside, the room was almost pitch black, the shadows so dense they seemed to have weight, like they could reach out and drag him into the dark. His breath caught in his throat as his eyes adjusted, and he could make out a shape, something tall, something looming in the corner of the room. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of mildew and something worse, something fetid, like rotting flesh. The figure stood motionless in the corner, its face obscured by the shadows. But Ben knew, with a certainty that cut through the fog of his thoughts, that this wasn't his mother. This was something else, and it was waiting for him. Ben! The voice called again, but this time it wasn't his mother's voice. It was deeper, guttural, a voice that didn't belong to anything human. The figure moved, slowly, impossibly so. Its limbs jerked with unnatural stiffness, like a puppet on broken strings. But even so, it was coming closer. Ben's heart thundered in his chest as he backed away, his hand fumbling for the doorframe. His feet stumbled over the floor, and he crashed against the wall, pain blooming in his side. He could feel his sanity beginning to fray, the edges of his mind slipping, unraveling like thread caught in a storm. Ben, don't leave me, the voice murmured, this time just behind him, a whisper in his ear. Too close. Too real. He turned, spinning on his heel, but no one was there. Only the oppressive darkness. Only the weight of something hunting him. And then the figure was in front of him. It was too fast, too close. Ben froze, his breath caught in his throat. The thing's face emerged from the shadows, a featureless mass of dark, smudged flesh. Its eyes, if they could even be called that, were like two black pits, sucking in light, swallowing every ounce of hope in their path. Ben's knees buckled, and he collapsed to the floor, his body trembling uncontrollably. The creature reached out, its hands long and skeletal, and in that instant, he knew he was about to die. The thing would drag him into the dark, into the abyss, and he would never see the light again. But then, just as the creature's fingers brushed against his skin, a sharp, guttural scream echoed through the room. Ben's eyes shot open in shock, and in that brief moment of confusion, he scrambled backward, his back slamming against the wall as the room suddenly spun around him. The scream wasn't the creature's, it was his mother's. Ben's blood ran cold as the door slammed shut behind him with a deafening thud. The creature paused, its head cocking to the side as if confused, but then it tilted back, a sound like a laugh, dry, crackling, emerging from its throat, and Ben knew in that moment that it wasn't over. Not yet. It had only just begun. End of Chapter 6. In this extended version of Chapter 6, I've added further psychological torment for Ben. As the walls close in around him, the tension builds with the presence of a malevolent force, and the atmosphere of dread deepens. Ben's uncertainty grows as he confronts not just the physical horror, but the emotional and psychological pull of what he believes to be his mother, ultimately leading him into a confrontation with a creature far worse than he imagined. The chapter ends on a note of ambiguity, leaving readers with a sense of looming terror. Chapter 7. The Unraveling. The house was alive. It wasn't just the shadows anymore. The very air itself had become oppressive, thick with something other. Ben's body moved on autopilot now, each step heavy, slow, as though the very floor beneath him had turned to quicksand. He could feel the weight of his thoughts pressing down on him, suffocating him in this place that was no longer a house, but a labyrinth, an inescapable mind-bending trap. The walls, once plain, once ordinary, had begun to shift in the corners of his vision. The wallpaper peeled like dry skin, revealing veins of black mold and old scars in the plaster beneath. There was a dampness to the air, a musty, decaying smell that clung to everything. The temperature had dropped too, a chill settling deep in his bones. It wasn't just cold, it was as if the house itself had become frozen, trapped in a moment where time had stopped, refusing to let go. Ben's breath came out in short, sharp bursts, his eyes darting around the hallway. His heart raced, thumping in his chest like a drumbeat, yet he felt no true fear. He was numb. He should have been terrified, but instead, he was trapped in a strange, almost detached state. The logical part of his mind screamed at him to escape, to run as far and fast as possible, but something deeper inside, something primal, was pushing him forward. There was something calling him. No, not something. Someone, a figure had appeared in the hallway. It wasn't clear at first. It was a shadow, like a part of the wall had come to life. But then, as Ben's eyes focused, he saw it, a figure that stood unnaturally still, half draped in the darkness, its outline shifting as if it were part of the house itself. The creature stood tall, its limbs impossibly long, stretched out like limbs of a spider, its form barely human. Ben's pulse quickened, his skin crawling with the sharp sting of fear that he could no longer ignore. He reached for the wall beside him to steady himself, feeling the rough surface of the paint beneath his fingers. His heart drummed louder now, deafening in his ears, as he tried to convince himself that it was just his imagination. But he couldn't. The figure was real. He could feel it, pressing against him, suffocating him, pulling him deeper into this nightmare. The figure did not move. It waited. Ben swallowed, trying to find his voice, trying to force out words that would push this nightmare away. But his mouth was dry, his throat tight, the words lodged in his chest like rocks. Who are you? His voice trembled, barely a whisper, but it felt as though the air itself absorbed the words, muffling them before they ever left his lips. The figure did not answer. It did not speak, did not move, and yet, Ben knew it was listening. He could feel its gaze on him, sharp and predatory, even though he could not see its face. The air around him grew colder, each breath more labored, like the weight of the atmosphere was pushing down on him. He could hear his own heart pounding in his ears, but there was something else. something that had started to drown out the noise of his panic. A whisper. It was soft at first, like a gentle breeze, a voice that seemed to echo from nowhere and everywhere at once. But it was growing louder, clearer, almost as if it were right beside him. Ben froze, his breath catching in his throat as the whispering continued, relentless and agonizing. He couldn't make out the words. It was too soft, too indistinct, but it didn't matter. He could feel the malice behind it, the hunger, the endless gnawing hunger that seemed to seep into the very bones of the house. His body was moving again, though he had no control over it. His feet shuffled forward, his eyes wide with panic as he stepped closer to the figure, unable to stop himself. He felt as if he were being dragged toward it, pulled in by some unseen force, some invisible tether. The closer he got, the more distorted the figure became, its features warped, flickering like a broken television screen, before settling into something unrecognizable. He could see its eyes now, glowing faintly from the darkness. They were large, unnaturally so, and they glowed with a sickly greenish hue. But it wasn't the eyes that chilled him to the bone. It was the absence of something in them. The hollow, empty void that stared back at him, pulling him into the depths. Ben wanted to scream. He wanted to run, but he was paralyzed, rooted to the spot, his body refusing to move, his mind trapped in the vice of his own fear. Then it spoke. Its voice was like gravel grinding against bone, low and guttural, sending a shiver through every nerve in his body. "Come closer." The voice was familiar, too familiar. It was his mother's voice. No, it couldn't be. He'd buried her memory deep. That night, that horrible night, had shattered everything he thought he knew. He couldn't remember her like this. Not like this. "Please, Ben. Come closer." His legs moved again against his will. Each step felt heavier, as though the very ground beneath him was sucking him deeper into the darkness. He wanted to stop. He wanted to scream, to run, but it was too late. The voice, soft and coaxing, had him in its grip. He was compelled to move, drawn to the figure with a force greater than his own will. He was close now, so close. His chest tightened, each breath harder than the last, his heart thundering in his ears as the figure's hand slowly reached out toward him. Its fingers were long and gnarled, twisted like roots of a tree, with nails that scraped across the floor like claws. Ben could feel the weight of its presence on him now, could feel its breath on his face, hot and stale. He wanted to pull away, but his body refused. The darkness pressed in on him from every side, pushing him closer and closer until there was nowhere else to go. And then, just as the creature's hand brushed against his skin, the whispering stopped. The house fell silent. For a long, awful moment, everything was still. Then came the sound of a door creaking open. Ben whipped his head around, the sudden movement jerking him out of his trance-like state. But it was too late. The figure had vanished. In its place stood a door, an old, weathered door, cracked with age. It wasn't there before. It couldn't have been. But it was there now. And through the crack in the door, Ben could see something. A faint light, flickering like the last breath of a dying flame. He could hear something too, a sound like crying, soft, broken sobs that echoed through the darkness. His heart lurched. He knew what he had to do. Even though every fiber of his being screamed for him to run, to turn around and escape the house before it was too late, he couldn't. His legs were already moving, dragging him toward the door. The door creaked open as he stepped closer, the darkness swallowing him whole. End of Chapter 7. In this extended Chapter 7, Ben's experiences deepen as he encounters a malevolent force in the house that manipulates his emotions, drawing him into its web. The psychological horror intensifies, with Ben unable to distinguish between the real and the unreal. His perception of time and space begins to warp as he faces something far more sinister than he ever imagined. This chapter builds tension by blending physical terror with the haunting emotional pull of his memories and unresolved grief. Chapter 8. Whispers in the Dark. The door loomed in front of Ben, towering over him like an uninvited stranger in the midst of his disintegrating reality. Every muscle in his body screamed at him to turn away, to break free of the unrelenting pull that kept drawing him toward it. But he was too far gone. The door, dark and decaying as it was, had an irresistible allure. It called to him, not with a voice, but with something far deeper, far more primal. It was a compulsion, like a thread wrapped around his chest, tugging him closer, each step heavier than the last. The air felt suffocating now. It wasn't just cold, it was a biting, raw chill that cut straight through to his bones. His breath came out in sharp, painful gasps, each one visible in the frozen air. The sounds of his own heartbeat were deafening, pounding in his ears like the beat of a drum, urging him forward. His legs moved of their own accord, reluctant but forced into action, as though they were shackled to the darkness ahead. As his hand reached the doorknob, his fingers trembled. It was slick with condensation, as if the door itself was sweating, alive with some strange, unseen presence. His pulse quickened, and for a moment, he was back in his childhood home. Her home. He could smell the familiar scent of dust, the faded perfume that once lingered in the air, could hear the creak of the floorboards underfoot. But then the moment passed, the memories slipping away like smoke, replaced by the suffocating darkness that surrounded him. He pushed open the door. The hinges groaned, low and unnatural, as the door slowly opened to reveal the next part of his descent into madness. The room inside was large, the walls shrouded in shadows that seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally. The faintest flicker of light illuminated the far corner, casting eerie shapes on the walls that flickered like broken shadows. The air was thick with dust, the musty smell of neglect hanging in the space. It felt wrong. Not just the room, but the very air. Everything about it felt out of place, like stepping into a parallel world. A world where time no longer followed the same rules. Ben stepped inside, his footfall muffled by the rotting carpet beneath him. The floor seemed to absorb his weight, as though it too was sinking into the void of the room. He paused, his heart racing. There was something watching him. He turned sharply, but there was no one there. The flickering light in the corner, the only light in the room, caught his eye again. It was coming from a cracked mirror hanging on the wall. The edges of the glass were smudged, stained with grime and dust. But there was something behind the glass that caught his attention. Movement. He wasn't imagining it. There was someone, or something, standing just beyond the glass, their shape hazy and distorted, like a reflection struggling to form. Ben froze, his throat tight with fear. He could feel his pulse in his throat now, the beat so loud it almost drowned out everything else. But the whispering had begun again, soft, broken, like 1,000 voices woven together in a symphony of despair. It came from all around him, seeping from the cracks in the walls, the floorboards, the very air itself. Ben, come closer. The voice was familiar, too familiar. It was his mother's voice, broken and distant. His stomach twisted in knots. He tried to move, but his legs wouldn't obey. His body was stiff, locked in place, as if some unseen force had tethered him to the room. The whispering continued, louder now, urgent, pleading. "You're so close, Ben. So close." His heart hammered in his chest as he slowly turned back to the mirror. His reflection was distorted, just like the figure behind it. His face was blurry, like he was submerged in water, his features melting and shifting, nothing holding them in place. But there was something else in the reflection. A dark figure, a shadow in the shape of a person, standing just behind him. Ben's breath caught in his throat. The figure was standing too still, too perfectly, as if it were waiting, watching. "Ben!" The whisper again, this time right behind him. He whipped around, panic seizing him, but there was nothing there, just the empty room, just the endless shadows. The reflection in the mirror shifted again, this time clearer. A face appeared behind him, its features sharp, gaunt, and hollow. It was a face Ben knew, a face he had hoped to forget. His mother's face, her eyes wide, her mouth twisted in a silent scream. No, it couldn't be. His hand shot out, slamming against the mirror in an attempt to shatter the glass, to break the connection between the reflection and the thing on the other side. But the glass didn't break. It didn't even crack. Instead, it rippled like water, the surface vibrating with an unnatural hum. The figure in the mirror smiled, the expression twisted into something grotesque, inhuman. Its smile stretched impossibly wide, exposing rows of jagged teeth, sharp as razors. Ben's stomach lurched, bile rising in his throat, as the figure's eyes shifted from wide and vacant to dead. There was no life behind them, no humanity, just an empty void, staring into his soul. The whispering grew louder, the voices mingling with laughter, soft, maddening, and chilling. The air around him thickened, as if the walls were closing in, suffocating him. His thoughts became sluggish, each one clouded with a strange haze. The whispers blurred into one continuous hum, a sound that crawled beneath his skin and twisted its way into his mind. Ben stumbled backward, his legs faltering beneath him. He tried to turn away to escape, but the room itself had changed. The door was no longer where it had been. It was gone. The walls had closed in, the light dimming as shadows lengthened. A hand, cold, skeletal, reached out from the mirror. It was long, its fingers spindly and unnaturally stretched. But the most horrifying thing was the way it moved. Slowly, deliberately, as if savoring the moment before the final strike. Ben's body moved against his will again, his arms reaching toward the hand that beckoned him, pulling him closer, inch by inch, his mind screaming for him to stop, but his limbs no longer obeyed. His fingers brushed against the cold surface of the glass, and he felt the ice-cold touch of the hand from the other side. And then, with a jolt, the room was silent again. The mirror was empty, the figure gone, the hand released its grip. But it didn't matter. The air had changed. The space felt more alive now, more oppressive, as if something was watching him from every corner, every shadow. The whispering stopped, replaced by something far worse. A voice, deep and guttural, reverberated through the walls. "You're not leaving, Ben." The words were spoken with an eerie finality. The voice wasn't human, not entirely. It was something far older, something that had been waiting for him. Ben stumbled backward again, his breath coming in shallow gasps. His mind was unraveling. He could feel the darkness closing in around him, pressing him from every side. The room was no longer just a space. It had become something else, something alive, something that could feel him, could sense his every movement. He needed to leave. He needed to run, but he couldn't, not anymore. Chapter 9. The Unraveling. Ben couldn't escape it. The pull was undeniable, a force stronger than anything he'd ever encountered in his life. It was like the house itself had come alive, its heartbeat synchronized with his own. The whispers had grown louder, more insistent, as if the walls themselves were alive with voices, some familiar, others foreign, all unrelenting. Each one begged for his attention, demanded his fear, each one wanting him to hear the truth that no living soul should ever hear. The air in the room was thick with dread, suffocating him, pushing against his lungs, making it harder to breathe. His mind, once sharp and clear, now felt fragmented, like pieces of a shattered mirror. He couldn't think straight, couldn't hold on to a single coherent thought. The house had a way of distorting everything. Time, perception, memory, turning it into a sickening dream he couldn't wake from. He stood in the center of the room, his body rigid, his eyes fixed on the cracked mirror. His reflection stared back at him, but it wasn't his reflection anymore. It was twisted, a warped version of himself. His skin was pale, his eyes dark and hollow, his smile distorted into something grotesque. The man in the glass wasn't Ben. It was something else. Something that had taken him, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but an empty shell. And yet, he couldn't look away. The laughter started again, soft at first, like a distant echo, and then growing louder, more frantic. It clawed at his mind, each laugh a jagged edge against his sanity. He felt like he was being dragged beneath the surface of a roiling sea, drowning in the suffocating laughter that felt both mocking and triumphant. It wasn't human. It couldn't be. The sound was inhuman, primal, a horrible thing that echoed through his bones. He stepped back, his legs wobbling beneath him as if they had forgotten how to move. The room seemed to pulse around him, the walls breathing, expanding, contracting, like the heartbeat of something alive. The air was heavy with the scent of rot, a nauseating mixture of decay and something sweeter, more insidious, like the perfume of death itself. His eyes darted around the room, but all he could see were shadows. The light in the corner flickered weakly, casting more grotesque shapes on the walls. For a moment, he thought he saw something move, just a flicker in the corner of his eye, something skittering across the floor, just out of reach. A trick of the light, he told himself, nothing more. But the shadow was still there. It crawled toward him, faster this time, skittering across the floor like some kind of insect. Ben could feel his heart pounding in his chest, each beat a painful thud against his ribs. His mouth went dry, his throat tightening with fear. He tried to scream, but no sound escaped his lips. His voice was trapped inside, like everything else inside him was trapped by the house, by the force that controlled it, by the thing that had been waiting for him. The shadow stopped at his feet, and for a moment, there was silence. Ben's body trembled, frozen in place, as if he had become a part of the room, an unwilling part of the macabre display. He couldn't move. He couldn't think. The house had taken him, and there was no escaping it. Then the whisper came again. Ben! It was soft, almost tender, as if it was trying to coax him, to make him listen, to make him understand. But he didn't want to understand. He didn't want to hear it. "You're mine now," the voice whispered, its tone both soothing and sinister. "You always have been. You just didn't know it yet." Ben's chest tightened as if something was squeezing his heart. The darkness in the room seemed to grow thicker, swallowing the faint light from the corner. The shadow at his feet began to move again, but now it was different. It was no longer just a shadow. It had form. It had shape. It was creeping up his legs, wrapping around his body, tightening like a noose, suffocating him with its cold, clammy presence. He gasped for air, but it was no use. The room had become a tomb, a prison. There was no way out. The walls had closed in around him, and the door he had once come through had vanished. There was only the mirror, only the dark, twisted reflection that beckoned him, drawing him in deeper with every breath. His eyes flickered back to the mirror. This time, it wasn't just his reflection. The other figure, the one that had been haunting him, had returned. It was standing just behind him, its face a mask of agony, twisted in eternal torment. Its eyes were wide, unblinking, as if it had been staring at him for years, waiting for the moment when he would finally break. The thing behind him was no longer just a reflection. It was part of him, a dark shadow that had been following him from the beginning. The whisper grew louder. "You're just like me," it said, the voice thick with malice. "You're lost. You've always been lost." Ben's knees buckled beneath him, and he collapsed to the floor, unable to tear his eyes away from the reflection. The walls seemed to close in tighter, and the air grew heavier with each passing second. The shadow wrapped around him, squeezing tighter, suffocating him with its cold grip. The mirror, his reflection, was all that remained of him. A broken, twisted version of himself that had never really been real. He reached out with trembling fingers, desperate, clawing at the air, but there was nothing left. The mirror had taken everything, his identity, his soul, his mind. He was just another lost spirit, another soul trapped by the darkness, by the thing that had been waiting for him. The room was silent now, save for the steady hum of the darkness, the low, constant thrum that seemed to vibrate from the very walls. Ben's breath was shallow, his chest rising and falling in ragged bursts as the last of his consciousness slipped away. His thoughts were slipping through his fingers like sand, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The darkness took him, piece by piece, and in the end, he was nothing. Chapter 10. The final night. The house was suffocating. The walls seemed to close in around Jack, pressing down on him with an oppressive weight that made it hard to breathe. He hadn't slept in days, not since Jeff, no, whatever Jeff had become, had begun to change. That smile, those hollow eyes, the words that slipped from his lips like poison. Go to sleep. The words haunted Jack, chased him, followed him through the darkened halls of the house, in his thoughts, in his dreams. Every corner of the house seemed to whisper. Every shadow moved, stretching, swirling, watching. It was as if the house had become alive, its very foundation feeding off the terror that had settled deep inside Jack's heart. Something was wrong with this place, with Jeff. But what could Jack do? He was only a boy, trapped in the nightmare his brother had become. It had started with the strange visions Jeff had confessed to seeing, and Jack's suspicion that something darker was pulling at his brother. But now, with each passing night, it was clear. It wasn't just Jeff that had changed. The house was sick, infected by whatever evil had taken hold of him. And Jack could feel it in the air. It was everywhere, suffocating him. But worse than that, he knew he was next. He had tried everything, tried to talk to Jeff, tried to reach out to him. But the boy he had known was gone. Jeff's transformation wasn't just physical. It was something deeper, something that had warped him, twisted him into a monster. There was no logic anymore, no sanity, just madness. And that madness had consumed their home. Jack had seen it in the empty stare of his brother, in the cruel words that spilled from his lips. And now, as he sat in the dark of his room, he could hear it. The scraping, that familiar sound, growing louder, closer. It was Jeff, or what was left of him, scraping something against the walls again. Thud, scrape, thud, scrape. Jack's pulse quickened. It wasn't just a sound anymore, it was a presence. The house seemed to shake with each scrape, each movement. He could feel it in the pit of his stomach, like something was crawling closer, crawling toward him, pulling him into the abyss. "It's coming for you, Jack." The thought echoed in his mind. The whispers were back again too, low, soft, like a cold breath against his ear. "Go to sleep, Jack. Go to sleep." He didn't want to sleep. He couldn't. Every time he closed his eyes, Jeff was there, his smile wide, his hollow eyes gleaming in the dark. He saw the twisted figure standing in the shadows of his nightmares, beckoning him, and each time he felt the presence closing in. But Jack was tired, so tired. The weight of fear, of exhaustion, of dread was too much to bear. He couldn't fight it anymore. Maybe he needed to sleep. Maybe the voices were right. Maybe if he closed his eyes, the torment would stop. Maybe it would end. But deep down, Jack knew the truth. There was no escaping this. No escaping Jeff. Suddenly, the scraping stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. Jack held his breath. His heartbeat thudded in his chest as he listened, every nerve on edge. The house was still, too still. Even the wind outside had stopped its howling. It was as if the world itself had held its breath. Then he heard it, the faintest creak of the floorboards just outside his door, a slow, deliberate step. Click. The door to his room creaked open. Jack didn't move. His heart seemed to freeze in his chest. There in the doorway stood Jeff, but he wasn't the boy Jack had grown up with. No, this was something else. A shadow of a person. His face was pale. No, not pale. Sickly, like a corpse that had been left to rot too long. His eyes were deep, hollow pits, dark as the night, like they had consumed the very light around them. His smile. It wasn't a smile anymore. It was a rictus grin, stretched too wide, too grotesque, like a mask that had been painted on his face. "Go to sleep, Jack." The words dripped from his lips like venom, his voice hollow and cold. And behind him, in the darkness of the hallway, Jack could see it, the thing lurking, its outline shifting like a shadow that didn't belong. No, it wasn't Jeff, it couldn't be. This wasn't his brother anymore. The thing that wore Jeff's face tilted its head, and Jack could almost feel the presence behind him growing stronger, reaching out, pulling at his soul. It was as if the house itself was alive, feeding on the terror, feeding on him. And then, as if in answer, the words came again. The voice that was no longer Jeff's, but something older, something darker, whispered through the air. "Sleep, Jack. It's time. Surrender." Jack's breath caught in his throat. The urge to run, to escape, was overwhelming, but his legs felt frozen. He couldn't move, couldn't scream. All he could do was watch as Jeff, no, the thing, stepped closer, the shadow behind it swelling, like a monstrous presence that consumed the very space around them. Jack felt the walls closing in. He felt the house pressing down on him, squeezing the air from his lungs. He could feel the cold fingers of fear wrap around his throat, the darkness taking root in his mind. But then, something in him snapped. Something in his heart screamed against it. No, not like this. Not without a fight. With everything he had left, Jack surged forward, breaking free of the paralysis that had held him. He pushed the door open and ran, his legs pounding against the cold floor, his mind burning with the need to escape, to break free from the hell that his brother, no, the thing, had brought with him. He didn't look back. The whispers grew louder, the darkness chasing him, closing in. But Jack didn't stop. He didn't know how long he ran. Minutes, hours, it didn't matter. But he finally reached the stairs, the way out. He rushed down them, his heart slamming against his chest, until he reached the front door. It was open. The wind howled outside, the cold air a sharp relief against his burning skin. He didn't hesitate. Jack bolted through the door, not caring about the house behind him, not caring about what waited in the dark. All he knew was that he couldn't stay there, not with it, not with them. As he ran into the night, the shadows of the house behind him seemed to stretch out, reaching for him. But Jack kept running, driven by the raw instinct to survive, to escape the nightmare that had claimed his brother and his home. He didn't know where he was going. He didn't care. He just needed to get away. Because if he stayed, he knew it would never end. It would never let him go. And in the distance behind him, he could still hear it. The whisper, the voice, calling to him, "Go to sleep, Jack." And Jack knew, with every fibre of his being, that it would never stop. Finale, the endless silence. Ben's soul was no longer his own. The house had claimed him, its insidious tendrils wrapping around his mind, his body, his very essence. The nightmarish world that had begun as whispers and flickers of dread had unfolded into a full-blown abyss, pulling him into the depths of an eternity that stretched beyond the concept of time. The line between reality and hallucination had long since dissolved, and now he was nothing more than a prisoner in a cage made of fear. He could still hear the whispers, those voices that had been with him since the beginning. Soft, taunting, promising salvation and damnation in the same breath. But now, the voices didn't whisper. They howled, they screamed, their words breaking through the silence, filling every corner of his fractured mind. The voices were no longer faint. They were loud, insistent, as if they were now the ones in control. Ben was simply a spectator, his body nothing but an empty vessel for whatever dark force had taken root inside him. There was a moment, one fleeting instant, when Ben thought he could escape. He thought of running, of leaving everything behind, of breaking free from the suffocating grip of the house, the darkness, the thing that haunted him. But it was too late. He had crossed the threshold, and now there was no going back. The house had consumed him, and he had become a part of it, his soul intertwined with its malevolent heart. The walls of the house closed in around him, their familiar coldness pressing against his skin. But this time it was different. The walls moved. They seemed to shift, to pulse with a life of their own. The house wasn't just a structure. It was a living, breathing thing, a twisted, sentient entity that fed on fear, on pain, on the suffering of those who wandered too close to its grasp. The walls weren't just barriers, they were prisons, keeping the lost souls inside, trapping them in an endless cycle of torment. Ben had once thought that he was the victim in this story, but now he realized the truth. He was the villain. The house had not brought him here by chance. It had been waiting for him. All the signs, the clues, the strange occurrences, all of it had been part of its plan. The mirror, the whispers, the sudden fits of madness, all of it was designed to break him down, to strip him of his will, his identity, his humanity. And now that it had succeeded, Ben was no longer a person. He was a part of the house. He was a tool, a weapon, a puppet to be used in whatever dark ritual the house had planned. The thing that had haunted him, that had stalked him from the shadows, stepped forward now, its form a shifting, grotesque amalgamation of every nightmare he had ever known. It was tall, impossibly tall, with arms that reached down to the ground, long and skeletal, each finger ending in sharp, cruel claws. Its face was a nightmare in itself, empty eye sockets that stared into Ben's soul, a mouth twisted in a silent, mocking grin. And from its body, a strange mist poured, a thick black fog that seemed to eat the light, swallowing it whole, leaving nothing but darkness in its wake. "You belong to us," the creature hissed, its voice reverberating through the house, filling every crevice with its icy chill. "You always have." Ben could feel it now, the pressure, the weight of everything pressing down on him. The house, the darkness, the creature. It was all part of the same thing, part of the same endless, suffocating nightmare. There was no escape. There never had been. This was his fate. This was the truth he had been running from all along. The creature's laughter echoed through the room, a sound like broken glass being ground into dust, and Ben, for the first time, laughed with it. The laughter bubbled up from somewhere deep inside him, an unnatural sound, hollow and hollowed out, as though his body was being possessed by something far worse than anything he could comprehend. But there was no joy in his laughter. There was no sense of triumph. There was only the realization that this was it. This was the end. There was no victory here, no redemption. There was only the darkness, the never-ending abyss that had swallowed him whole. His body trembled as the creature stepped closer, its clawed hand reaching out toward him. The air around them was thick, suffocating. Ben could feel his chest tighten, his heart racing, the oppressive weight of the creature's presence pressing down on him. And as its fingers touched his shoulder, the last vestiges of his humanity slipped away. Everything went dark. Ben woke again, but he did not wake. The room was the same, but it felt different now. It felt colder, emptier. He was standing, but he couldn't feel his feet on the ground. His hands were no longer his own. He tried to scream, but his voice didn't respond. He tried to move, but his body was frozen in place, trapped in the same cycle that had consumed him. And then he saw it, the mirror, the cursed reflection that had started it all. But this time, the reflection was not his own. The face that stared back at him was twisted, deformed, a grotesque mockery of humanity. It was him, but it wasn't. The figure in the mirror smiled at him, its grin stretching wider, impossibly wide, until its face split open in a grotesque display of malice. Ben reached out, but his fingers couldn't touch the glass. It was too far, too distant. "You are ours," the creature's voice whispered in his mind, filling him with an endless sense of dread. "You are part of us now, forever." And then the house collapsed, but not in the way he expected. It didn't fall to the ground. It didn't crumble. Instead, it shifted. The walls expanding, the ceiling stretching, the very fabric of the house warping into something unrecognizable. The shadows bled into each other, consuming the light, until there was no distinction between the real and the imagined. Everything had become a part of it. The house, the creature, the dark presence that had taken over his soul. It was all one, a singular, monstrous entity that had no beginning and no end. Ben's final scream echoed in the endless void, and then there was silence, nothing but the endless darkness and the whispers. Epilogue: The Unbroken Cycle. The house stood still, unchanged. It waited. It always had. This conclusion is both a surrender and a curse. Ben, the protagonist, has now become one with the very thing that haunted him, his journey ending in a never-ending spiral of horror. The cycle continues, as the house remains, eternally hungry for those who cross its threshold. This ending brings a tragic, unresolved closure to the tale, allowing for reflection on the themes of fate, inescapable terror, and the nature of suffering. The house continues, and its curse will never end, trapping those who dare to uncover its secrets.